The beam of my flashlight felt like a thin, pathetic ribbon against the swallowing black of the forest, and every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, was a personal assault. I was moving, faster than I should have been, stumbling over roots and rocks, my breath ragged and cold in my lungs. My mind screamed at me to run, to just get out, but a part of me, a primal, terrified part, kept glancing back, searching the gloom behind me. That's when I heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the direction of the abandoned tent carried on the frigid night air. It wasn't a word I could discern, just a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. And then a shadow, thin and impossibly tall, detached itself from the deeper darkness at the edge of my peripheral vision before vanishing again. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat counting down to something unimaginable. But before that night, before the fear became a constant, gnawing presence, before the whispers wormed their way into my sanity, there was a summer I had looked forward to, a chance to escape the city's concrete sprawl and reconnect with the quiet majesty of nature. It all started last summer when I took a seasonal position as a park ranger at the Blackwood National Forest. I'd grown up with a deep appreciation for the outdoors, fostered by countless family camping trips and my father's encyclopedic knowledge of local flora and fauna. The idea of spending 3 months immersed in ancient woods, with the responsibility of preserving its natural beauty and ensuring visitor safety, sounded like a dream. The salary wasn't fantastic, but the benefits of solitude, clean air, and the sheer scale of the wilderness were payment enough for me. My colleagues, a small, tight-knit group of seasoned rangers, welcomed me warmly, and the initial weeks were everything I'd hoped for. Patrols involved long hikes, checking trails, maintaining campsites, and occasionally assisting lost hikers or mediating minor disputes between campers. It was a good life, a simple life, and I felt a profound sense of peace settling over me. My designated patrol zone was primarily the northern sector, a less trafficked area known for its denser old-growth forest and more challenging terrain. It was here, off the main trails, that I truly felt the ancient pulse of the woods. The air was constantly cool, even on the hottest days, and the canopy was so thick that sunlight often struggled to reach the forest floor, creating a perpetual twilight. The silence there wasn't empty. It was a living, breathing quiet, filled with the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant call of a hawk, the murmur of the wind through the pines. It was a place where you could easily get lost, not just physically, but metaphorically, in the sheer grandeur of it all. As a ranger, I learned to navigate these areas using a combination of GPS, topographical maps, and an uncanny ability to read the forest itself, the slope of the land, the direction of water flow, the subtle cues of animal trails. The job required a certain level of self-reliance, an ability to trust your instincts when you were miles from the nearest human soul. I'd always prided myself on that. It was late July when I first stumbled upon it. I was conducting a routine off-trail survey, checking for illegal campsites or any signs of environmental damage. The area was particularly remote, requiring a solid 4-hour hike from the nearest access road. I remember the exact moment clearly. I had been following a faint deer path, a network of barely discernible tracks often used by animals to move through dense underbrush. When the scent hit me, it wasn't unpleasant, not at first, just distinctly out of place, a faint whiff of canvas and wood smoke clinging to the damp air. My training kicked in immediately. Unregistered campsites were a common issue, sometimes leading to unchecked fires or litter. I pushed through a particularly thick cluster of rhododendrons, branches snapping back, and there it was, an abandoned tent. It was a medium-sized dome tent, a fairly common model, pitched in a small, almost perfectly circular clearing about 50 feet off the deer path. What struck me immediately was its pristine condition, despite the apparent abandonment. No signs of wear, no mildew, no torn fabric. The bright orange and gray nylon gleamed faintly under the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. The pegs were driven in neatly taut lines holding it firm. It looked as if its occupants had simply walked away. No, not walked away, disappeared. My initial thought was that it was simply a forgotten campsite. Perhaps someone had packed up in a hurry and left the tent behind. It happens, though rarely with such a high-quality tent in such a remote spot. I approached cautiously, calling out the standard ranger greeting, "Hello, park ranger. Anyone here?" My voice felt swallowed by the immensity of the forest. There was no reply, only the continued watchful silence of the woods. I circled the tent, examining its exterior. There were no footprints around it, which was odd, given the damp earth. The ground under the tent itself looked undisturbed, as if it had simply materialized there. The entrance flap was loosely tied shut, not completely closed but not wide open either. A shiver, not of cold but of something else, traced its way up my spine. This wasn't a typical abandoned campsite. Usually there would be trash, a forgotten backpack, a fire pit, even if poorly managed. This was clean, too clean. I untied the flap and peered inside. The interior was surprisingly spacious. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness. What I saw made me pause. There was a sleeping bag rolled up neatly at the far end in a vibrant shade of electric blue. Beside it, a small deflated air mattress, a folded camping chair, a paperback novel face down on the chair, its spine unbroken, a generic fantasy cover visible, all standard camping gear. But there was something else. On a small makeshift table crafted from a fallen log sat a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a robin, its eyes tiny polished beads, and next to it, a single, freshly picked wild violet nestled in a small depression in the log. It looked as if it had just been placed there. My ranger training dictated that I should log the discovery, mark its GPS coordinates, and then, if no one claimed it after a reasonable period, arrange for its removal. But something about this particular scene gave me pause. The neatness, the fresh violet. It felt less like an abandonment and more like a temporary departure, or a ritual. I found myself looking around the clearing again, unconsciously searching for a sign, a clue. The trees around the clearing were tall, ancient pines and firs, their lower branches completely devoid of needles, reaching up like gnarled, silent sentinels. The light filtering through them seemed to hold a different quality here, softer, more diffused. I left the tent as I found it, tying the flap loosely again. I made a mental note to return in a few days. Perhaps the occupants were simply on a long day hike, or maybe they were trappers who used the tent as a base camp, though trapping was strictly regulated within the park boundaries. Still, the feeling lingered, a sense of something being profoundly out of place, a subtle disruption in the otherwise harmonious symphony of the forest. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe I was overthinking it. Spending too much time alone in the wilderness can do that to a person, make you susceptible to imagined mysteries. But the image of that single, fresh violet next to the wooden bird stuck in my mind. It was a small detail, easily dismissed, but it felt significant somehow. A silent offering, or a silent warning. I recorded the coordinates in my logbook, noting unattended tent, northern sector. A prickle of unease started to form, a tiny seed of doubt planted in the back of my mind, even as I told myself it was just an anomaly. The forest was vast, and people did strange things. I would keep an eye on this particular anomaly. I waited 4 days before returning to the abandoned tent. My patrol schedule allowed for it, and frankly, I needed some time to mentally compartmentalize the oddity. The rational part of me kept insisting it was just a strange occurrence, easily explained by someone's unusual camping habits. Perhaps they had a different base camp, and this was merely a temporary shelter for hunting or observation, and they simply hadn't returned yet. But the other part, the instinctual part that prickled at the back of my neck, wasn't so easily placated. I found myself thinking about it between tasks, the image of that neatly rolled sleeping bag and the fresh violet a constant, nagging flicker in my mind's eye. The sheer remoteness of its location was a key factor. This wasn't a spot anyone accidentally stumbled upon. You had to actively seek it out, pushing deep into the forest where the trails dissolved into game paths. When I finally hiked back, the weather had shifted. A fine, persistent drizzle had started just as I entered the deeper woods, making the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The canopy offered little protection, and soon my rain jacket was slick. The usually vibrant greens of the undergrowth seemed muted, almost somber. As I approached the clearing, a strange quiet descended. The usual chirping of birds, the rustle of unseen critters, they seemed to dim, creating an almost oppressive stillness around the tent. This wasn't merely the dampening effect of rain, it felt like a void. As a ranger, you learn to distinguish between natural silence and an unnatural one. This was the latter. I made my way to the familiar thicket of rhododendrons, pushing through them with a sense of trepidation that felt entirely unwarranted. There it stood, the orange and gray nylon, a stark contrast against the deep greens of the surrounding foliage. It looked exactly as I'd left it, or so I thought. I circled it again, my eyes scanning the ground. No footprints, just as before. The damp earth should have registered something, even a light impression, but there was nothing. It was as if the rain had washed away all trace of human presence, or perhaps nothing had ever been there to leave a trace. I paused at the loosely tied entrance flap, my hand hovering for a moment. This time, the knot seemed tighter, more deliberate than I remembered. A small detail, perhaps easily dismissed as a trick of memory or the effect of the rain shrinking the fabric, but it added to the growing unease. I hesitated, taking a deep breath, the damp air cold in my lungs. Then I pulled the flap open. The interior was dim, as expected. I switched on my flashlight. The sleeping bag was still neatly rolled. The deflated air mattress was still there, the folded camping chair, and the paperback novel. My beam landed on the small, makeshift log table. The intricately carved wooden robin was still there, its polished bead eyes seeming to catch the light. But the wild violet was gone. My breath hitched. I distinctly remembered the vibrant purple bloom. It was gone, vanished without a trace, and in its place, nestled in the same small depression in the log, was a single smooth gray river stone. Not a stone you'd find naturally in this part of the forest. Its color and texture suggested it had come from a fast-flowing river, not the gentle streams nearby. My heart started to pound a little harder. This was beyond odd, a fresh flower disappearing and being replaced by a river stone. It was deliberate. Someone had been here, but who, and why such a strange exchange? I picked up the paperback novel. Before, it had been lying face down on the chair. Now it was open, though I couldn't see to what page from my vantage point. I picked it up, and my fingers registered the distinct chill of the pages. The book was open to a page describing a character's journey through a labyrinthine forest, an almost uncanny echo of my own situation. My mind reeled. Had I left it open before? I was certain I hadn't. I always close books when I leave them. It felt like a direct response, a subtle acknowledgement of my previous visit. I pulled out my phone, despite knowing there wouldn't be any signal this deep in the woods, and tried to snap a few photos of the interior. The low light made them blurry, almost useless, but I felt an urgent need for documentation, for proof against my own wavering sanity. I needed to know I wasn't imagining this. The air inside the tent felt heavy, almost stagnant, yet paradoxically, there was a faint, earthy smell, like overturned soil and damp leaves, that hadn't been there before. It was a smell I associated with ancient burial grounds, not a temporary shelter. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to get out, but my curiosity, mingled with a growing dread, kept me rooted. Was this some elaborate prank? But who would go to such lengths so far off the beaten path? And for what purpose? I looked at the river stone again, turning it over in my fingers. It was smooth, cool, and utterly unremarkable, yet it felt heavy with unspoken meaning. Like a message, but what kind of message? The tent felt less abandoned now and more like a carefully maintained, secretive space. The idea that it was truly empty seemed less and less plausible. The silence outside felt like a watchful presence holding its breath. I felt a distinct chill, not from the dampness, but from the unsettling realization that I was no longer an observer, but perhaps an intruder. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I had a clear job to do, duties and protocols to follow, but this situation fell outside any ranger handbook I'd ever read. I spent another 15 minutes inside the tent, meticulously searching for any other clues, any indication of who might be doing this. I checked under the sleeping bag, inside the folds of the camping chair, even beneath the small log table. Nothing, just the pristine, unnervingly tidy interior. There were no personal belongings, no toiletries, no food wrappers, nothing to suggest a prolonged stay or even a short one. It was all generic camping gear, almost purposefully devoid of any identifying markers. This lack of personal touch, combined with the bizarre gifts, only heightened the sense of calculated strangeness. The whole setup screamed of deliberate anonymity. It was a puzzle with no discernible pieces, only increasingly baffling clues. As I finally backed out of the tent, my eyes scanned the opening. My gaze caught on a tiny, almost invisible tear in the fabric of the inner mesh, right at the very top, near one of the ventilation flaps. It was too small to have been made by a branch or an animal. It looked almost like a deliberate pinprick, a tiny viewing hole. My heart leaped into my throat. Who would need such a specific vantage point from within the tent? Or was it to look out? The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was the kind of detail you'd only notice if you were really looking, really searching for something amiss. That tiny tear, so easily missed, now seemed to pull at the very fabric of my composure. I quickly backed away, tying the flap shut again, my hands trembling slightly. The silence of the clearing no longer felt empty but occupied, watchful. I was certain of it. This abandoned tent wasn't empty at all, and whatever was inside, or had been inside, was playing a very strange, unsettling game. The memory of that tiny pinprick tear in the tent's mesh haunted me for days. It was a detail so minute, so easily overlooked, yet it had lodged itself in my mind, festering. The idea that someone or something had been watching me from inside, or was still watching, gnawed at my sense of security. The distinction between an abandoned tent and one that was merely unattended blurred into something far more sinister. I found myself replaying the scene in my head, analyzing every move, every word I'd spoken, wondering if I had unwittingly given away too much. The forest, once my sanctuary, began to feel less like a haven and more like a vast, indifferent stage upon which an unsettling drama was unfolding, with me as an unwilling participant. I started to change my patrol routes, subconsciously at first, giving the northern sector a wider berth. But the pull of the unknown was too strong, and my professional duty always reasserted itself. I had to investigate. I had to understand. My colleagues noticed my preoccupation, the slightly distant look in my eyes. "Everything all right, Alex?" Ranger Miller, a stout man with a booming laugh and an even heartier handshake, asked me one evening over lukewarm coffee in the ranger station. "You seem a bit antsy." I brushed it off, blaming it on the long hours and the heat, but I knew I wasn't fooling anyone. How could I explain a disappearing violet and a replacement river stone without sounding utterly delusional? The psychological burden of this strange secret started to weigh heavily on me. The uncertainty was a corrosive force, slowly eroding my peace of mind. My next visit was a week later, under the guise of an extended trail maintenance check. I armed myself not only with my usual tools but also with a growing sense of dread. The hike felt longer, the trees taller, their shadows deeper. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. I found myself instinctively scanning the trees around the clearing long before I reached it, searching for any sign of movement, any anomaly in the forest. The air was close, humid, clinging to my skin. As I finally pushed through the rhododendrons into the familiar clearing, my breath caught in my throat. The tent was still there, but it was different. The orange and gray nylon, previously vibrant, now seemed duller, almost faded, as if time had accelerated its aging process in that secluded spot. The ropes, which had been taut, now sagged slightly, giving the whole structure a weary, slouched appearance. It looked less like something recently pitched and more like it had been standing there for decades, slowly yielding to the elements. And the entrance flap was fully open, not just untied but folded back invitingly or perhaps menacingly. A gust of wind rippled through the clearing, making the open flap flutter like a tattered flag. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket pressed against my ears. I approached slowly, my hand instinctively going to the utility knife on my belt, a useless gesture against whatever eerie presence was unfolding here. Stepping into the tent felt like crossing a threshold into another reality. The air inside was cold, bone-chillingly so, despite the humid summer day outside. My breath plumed faintly in front of me. The interior, once unnervingly tidy, was now unsettlingly arranged. The sleeping bag was unrolled, not carelessly, but carefully spread out, as if someone had just gotten up. The deflated air mattress was still there, but now a small indentation was visible, as if a body had recently been resting on it. The folded camping chair was gone, vanished, and in its place on the log table sat the paperback novel open. Not just open, but weighted down by the smooth, gray river stone I'd seen before. The page it was open to was highlighted, not with a marker but with a thin, almost translucent smear of what looked like dried mud, subtly smudged across a specific paragraph. The paragraph described the profound feeling of being watched in the deep wilderness, an oppressive sense of unseen eyes tracking every movement. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a prank anymore. This was calculated, precise, and deeply personal. It felt like a direct, silent communication, a demonstration of proximity and awareness. They knew I was coming. They knew I was looking, and they were leaving me messages. The ambiguity of it all was maddening. Was this a person, a group, or something else entirely? A shiver ran through my entire body, a primal fear awakening deep within me. The faint earthy smell, like overturned soil, was stronger now, mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood, though I dismissed that immediately as my imagination running wild. I looked frantically around the tent, my flashlight beam darting into every corner. The pinprick tear in the mesh, it was still there, but now just beneath it, clinging to the nylon, was a single, long, dark hair. It was too dark and too fine to be mine, and looked nothing like any animal hair I was familiar with. It was almost human, but not quite. It had a strange sheen to it, almost iridescent under the light. I felt a wave of nausea. Someone was sleeping here, or had been, and they were leaving me remnants of their presence. I had to get out. My instincts screamed at me to flee, to report this to my superiors, to have the entire area swept. But the rational side, which was rapidly losing its battle against the encroaching terror, reminded me that I had no concrete evidence, only bizarre occurrences and growing paranoia. How do you explain a tent that changes its interior layout, leaves cryptic messages, and seems to age overnight? They would think I was losing my mind, or worse, making it all up. My reputation, my job, would be on the line. I felt trapped, caught between an escalating supernatural dread and the mundane demands of my profession. This was no longer just about an abandoned tent. It was about my mental well-being. As I backed out of the tent, my eyes still fixed on that single dark hair, I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen before. On the ground just outside the tent entrance, half buried in the damp leaves, was a small, crudely carved wooden effigy. It was humanoid in shape, faceless, with stunted limbs, and strangely its chest cavity was hollowed out. Inside the cavity, nestled perfectly, was another smooth, gray river stone. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just a weird exchange of objects. This was a symbol, a warning. The faceless figure seemed to stare up at me, an empty hollow where its heart should be. It felt like a direct, menacing challenge. I covered the effigy with leaves, a desperate attempt to erase its presence, even as its image was burned into my mind. I stumbled away from the clearing, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, the unsettling belief settling in that whatever was in that abandoned tent knew me, watched me, and was now actively trying to communicate. And I had a terrifying feeling I didn't want to hear what it had to say. The wooden effigy, with its hollowed chest and the river stone nestled within, became a chilling focal point in my mind. It wasn't just a random carving. It was too deliberate, too specific. It felt like a direct, unsettling message, a declaration of intent. The image of it, half buried in the damp leaves, wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its faceless form. The psychological impact was profound. The forest, which had always been a source of comfort and peace, now felt imbued with a subtle, pervasive menace. I started to sense unseen eyes everywhere, the rustle of leaves becoming the whisper of a presence, the creak of branches sounding like slow, deliberate footsteps. My sense of security, once so solid, was now chipping away, piece by agonizing piece. My sleep became fractured, haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams. I would dream of the tent, but it would be impossibly vast inside, stretching into an endless, dark void, and I would hear faint whispers, just at the edge of comprehension, echoing from within its depths. I'd wake in a cold sweat, the silence of my small ranger cabin feeling less like peace and more like a vacuum before the next wave of unease. I tried to rationalize it all away. Stress, isolation, an overactive imagination. These were common afflictions for rangers spending extended periods in remote areas. I even looked up cases of bizarre cult activity or elaborate pranks in national parks, searching for any logical explanation, however far-fetched. But nothing fit. Nothing accounted for the specificity, the quiet intelligence behind the shifting displays in the abandoned tent. The influence of the tent's occupant began to intrude on my everyday life in more tangible ways. Back at the ranger station, I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder. I'd be reviewing trail maps, and my eyes would instinctively drift to the northern sector, to the faint, unlabeled clearing I knew held the orange and gray nylon. Twice, I caught myself drawing the small, faceless effigy on the margins of my patrol reports before quickly erasing it. I started leaving my cabin light on at night, something I'd never done before, as if a thin pane of glass and a few feet of wood could offer protection against something that seemed to defy physical boundary. One evening, I was organizing my gear for the next day's patrol, laying out my compass, first aid kit, and water bottles. My logbook, where I meticulously recorded my daily findings, was open on my desk. I had made a new entry about a fallen tree on the Eagle Peak Trail, then turned to grab my headlamp. When I turned back, my heart leaped into my throat. The logbook was still open, but a small, smooth, gray river stone was sitting squarely on the page. Exactly like the one in the tent, there was no one else in the cabin. The door was locked, the window was shut. My hands started to tremble uncontrollably. This wasn't happening at the tent anymore. It was here, in my personal space. The boundary had been breached. I stared at the stone, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Had I brought it back from the tent inadvertently? No, I was meticulous about not touching anything without gloves, and I hadn't taken the original stone. Had someone entered my cabin? It was almost impossible. The station was remote, visitors rare after dark, and my cabin was always secured. The implications were chilling. Whatever this presence was, it wasn't confined to the forest clearing. It was following me. It knew where I lived. The thought filled me with an icy dread that was far more potent than any fear I'd felt in the woods. I scooped up the stone with a piece of paper, my fingers unwilling to touch its smooth, cold surface, and dropped it into a heavy-duty evidence bag. I locked it away in my footlocker, as if mere physical containment could stop it, but the psychological damage was done. My cabin, my sanctuary, now felt compromised, tainted. I spent the rest of that night awake, clutching a heavy flashlight, listening to every creak of the old wooden structure, every rustle of leaves outside. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, and I found myself questioning my own sanity. Was I going mad? Was the isolation finally getting to me? Or was there something truly malevolent at play? I knew I couldn't keep this silent anymore. I considered telling Ranger Miller or even the park superintendent. But what would I say? A tent deep in the woods keeps changing its contents, and now mysterious river stones are appearing in my locked cabin. They would undoubtedly suggest a leave of absence, a psychological evaluation. My career would be over, and I'd be branded as unstable. The ambiguity was my cage. I felt utterly alone, trapped in a horrifying secret no one would ever believe. The next few days were a blur of heightened paranoia. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every sound seemed amplified. I avoided the northern sector altogether, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and that abandoned tent, but the dread clung to me like a shroud. I started noticing small, impossible details around my cabin, the faint smell of damp earth and pine, even when my windows were sealed. The way my paperback novel, a different one this time, would sometimes be open to a random page I hadn't been reading, almost as if someone had skimmed through it. Small things, easily dismissed as forgetfulness or coincidence, but cumulatively they formed a suffocating pattern. One afternoon, while on patrol in a different section of the park, I noticed something particularly unsettling. I was walking along a familiar stretch of trail, a wide, well-maintained path popular with day hikers. As I passed a cluster of towering old-growth firs, something caught my eye. Wedged deep within the gnarled bark of one of the trees, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was another one of the crudely carved wooden effigies. This one was even smaller, almost thumb-sized, but unmistakably the same design: faceless, stunted limbs, and the distinct hollow in its chest. And nestled tightly within that hollow, yes, another smooth, gray river stone. My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't near the tent. This was miles away, in a completely different sector, right on a public trail. It was a blatant, undeniable sign that whatever was doing this was no longer confined to the remote clearing. It was moving, deliberately placing these symbols, marking its territory, marking me. It was a direct escalation, a chilling expansion of its reach. The message was clear. There was no escaping it. The forest itself seemed to be conspiring against me, allowing these impossible things to manifest where they shouldn't be. The sense of isolation became absolute, a profound, crushing weight. I was being hunted, or perhaps simply observed, by something with an intelligence that defied explanation, and a patience that was terrifying in its scope. We're about to go deeper into this, and the story only gets darker from here. If you're enjoying this account and want to support the channel, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now let's get back to it. The discovery of the second effigy, miles from the abandoned tent, wasn't just a sign of escalating threat. It was a psychological breaking point. The realization that this entity, whatever it was, could place its markers anywhere, even on public trails, shattered the last remnants of my perceived safety. The rational world was crumbling around me, replaced by a terrifying, inexplicable reality. I felt like a character in a waking nightmare, desperately trying to find a logical explanation for events that consistently defied all logic. The paranoia became a constant companion, gnawing at my insides, twisting every shadow into a potential harbinger of dread. Sleep became impossible. The moment I closed my eyes, the images would flood in. The faceless effigies, the flickering light inside the tent, the unsettling sequence of exchanged objects. I began to lose weight, dark circles forming under my eyes, my movements becoming jumpy and erratic. My focus at work deteriorated. I found myself making small mistakes, forgetting protocols, my mind constantly sifting through impossible scenarios, trying to find an answer where none existed. My colleagues started to look at me with concern, sometimes even pity. Ranger Miller suggested I take a few days off, citing my obvious exhaustion. He didn't know the half of it. I knew I couldn't just walk away. The thought of leaving the tent, leaving the core of this terrifying mystery unsolved, was unbearable. It felt like walking out of a nightmare without ever knowing why it started or what it truly meant. Paradoxically, the horror had become an obsession. I felt an urgent, desperate need to confront it, to force some kind of explanation, even if it meant risking everything. I needed to know what was inside that abandoned tent, who was leaving these messages, and why. The uncertainty was far worse than any tangible threat. I made the decision to return to the northern sector, to the clearing, but this time, it wouldn't be a routine patrol. It would be a confrontation. I meticulously prepared, not for a camping trip but for a reconnaissance mission. I packed my most powerful flashlight, extra batteries, a sturdy knife, a portable shortwave radio, knowing it was useless for communication in that area, but the thought of it offered a sliver of false comfort, and a small, digital camera hoping to finally capture undeniable proof. The camera was old, a model I used mostly for documenting trail damage, but it was all I had. I also took a small silver compass, a gift from my father on my first solo trip, not for navigation, but for its cold, metallic weight in my hand, a small anchor to the real world. The hike back to the clearing felt like a pilgrimage to an unknown altar. The air was still and heavy, devoid of the usual sounds of the forest. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I kept my eyes peeled, scanning the trees, the undergrowth, searching for any sign of movement, any misplaced effigy. Each step was a deliberate act of courage, pushing through the suffocating fear that threatened to overwhelm me. The silence was so profound that I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, a drum roll introducing something dreadful. As I finally broke through the rhododendrons, the sight of the tent hit me with a physical blow. It was barely visible through the twilight gloom that had already settled in the clearing, even though it was only late afternoon. The orange and gray nylon, which had once seemed vibrant, now appeared almost black, soaking up the meager light. It stood slumped, more dilapidated than ever, as if something heavy had been pressing down on it. The entrance flap was no longer invitingly open, nor tied loosely. It was violently ripped, a jagged tear running from top to bottom, exposing the dark interior like a gaping wound. My breath hitched. This was different. This was an act of aggression, a deliberate act of destruction. It no longer looked like an abandoned tent. It looked like a place that had been violated or had violated itself. The sense of dread intensified, tightening its grip on my chest. I drew my utility knife, its small blade feeling utterly inadequate. The metallic smell, faint before, was now stronger, acrid. Something was profoundly wrong. I approached the torn tent slowly, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the interior. What I saw made my stomach churn. The sleeping bag was no longer neatly rolled or spread out. It was shredded, torn into strips, its synthetic filling strewn across the floor of the tent like grotesque entrails. The air mattress was punctured in multiple places, deflated and defiled. The small log table was overturned, its surface splintered, and the paperback novel was gone, completely gone. And then I saw it. On the floor, amidst the shredded sleeping bag and debris, was a crude drawing. It wasn't on paper. It was scored directly into the nylon floor of the tent with something sharp. A circle, with a single, elongated eye in the center, weeping a trail of what looked disturbingly like dried, dark fluid, not red, but a deep, rusty brown. And surrounding the eye, etched into the fabric as well, were countless tiny, almost microscopic symbols. They weren't letters or numbers I recognized. They looked like ancient runes, or perhaps the scrawlings of a deranged mind. Whatever they were, they pulsed with an unspoken malevolence. My mind screamed at me. This wasn't a human being. No person could have done this, then reappeared in my cabin, then placed effigies miles away. This was something else. something utterly inexplicable and terrifying. The cold within the tent seemed to intensify, wrapping around me, trying to press the air from my lungs. The earthy smell was overpowering, mingled with the metallic tang, and a new, almost floral scent, sickeningly sweet, like decaying blossoms. My eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The empty space felt crowded, teeming with an unseen presence. My gaze fell upon the far corner of the tent, where the nylon wall sagged inward. There, partially obscured by the torn sleeping bag, was a small, dark hole in the fabric of the inner wall of the tent, just above where the ground liner met the wall. It was too small for an animal, too neat. It looked almost drilled. And from that hole, a faint, almost imperceptible sound was emanating. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't loud, not overtly threatening, but it was consistent, like a heartbeat or something else, far more primal. It wasn't coming from outside the tent. It was coming from within the tent wall, from the space between the inner and outer layers of fabric. I crouched down, flashlight beam fixed on the hole, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The thumping grew infinitesimally louder, more distinct. It wasn't a heart. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, a rhythmic drag scrape against the fabric from the inside. And then a whisper, not in my ear, but in my mind, a cold, dry sensation that felt like sand skittering across my thoughts. "You found us." The voice wasn't actual sound. It was an impression, a feeling of being spoken to without words. The abandoned tent wasn't empty. It never had been. And whatever resided within its canvas walls had been waiting for me to fully understand. The whisper, "You found us," wasn't just a sound. It was an invasion, a cold tendril of thought that pierced the protective shell of my sanity. It was the absolute confirmation of my deepest fears, that this wasn't an abandoned tent playing strange games, but a conscious entity or entities that had been observing, manipulating, and finally communicating. The rhythmic drag scrape from within the tent wall, coupled with that mental intrusion, sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through me. My body screamed at me to flee, to abandon all pretense of explanation or understanding, and just run. But a morbid fascination, a desperate need for some kind of conclusion, kept me rooted to the spot, my flashlight beam still fixed on that small, dark hole. The thumping grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a faint, rustling sound, like dry leaves being dragged across a rough surface. The air in the tent grew colder, so cold that my breath plumed thicker, and I could feel the individual hairs on my arms standing on end. I could see the inner nylon of the tent wall pressing outwards slightly around the hole, as if something was moving just behind it, straining against the fabric. A dark, indistinct shape seemed to ripple under the surface, formless, yet undeniably present. It wasn't large, not human-sized, but its power was immense, radiating outwards, suffocating me. The earthy smell became overwhelming, a stench of damp soil and something else, something metallic and sweet, like carrion flowers blooming over an ancient grave. My mind, stretched to its breaking point, tried to construct an image, a logical form for this horror. An animal, a very strange, intelligent animal. But the whisper, the communication, defied that. This was something beyond the natural order of the forest. As I watched, paralyzed, a tiny, almost imperceptible slit appeared in the fabric just next to the drilled hole. And then slowly, meticulously, a small, dark, impossibly thin appendage, like a tendril of dried root, began to emerge from the slit. It was covered in tiny, almost crystalline hairs, glistening faintly under my flashlight beam. It moved with an unnatural precision, feeling the air, tasting it, sensing my presence. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles ached. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. The tendril twitched, its movement deliberate, almost curious. It seemed to stretch, growing longer, reaching for me. And then another one emerged, equally thin, equally dark, waving tentatively in the cold air. They were like the antennae of some monstrous insect, but with an intelligent, almost probing quality to their movements. My focus, however, was drawn back to the hole. The fabric around it seemed to stretch, thin and translucent, revealing faint, darker forms moving just beneath. And from that hole, another message, a stronger impression in my mind, not a whisper, but a cold, resonating hum. We are here. We have always been here. That was it. That was the last thread of rationality snapping. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight, which clattered to the shredded floor, its beam spinning wildly, painting chaotic arcs of light and shadow across the defiled interior. The tendrils recoiled back into the wall as if startled by the sudden light, or perhaps by my intense fear. I turned and scrambled out of the ripped entrance of the tent, no longer caring about proof or answers. All that mattered was escape. I ran blindly through the darkening forest, not bothering to consult my GPS or compass. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but the image of those tendrils, the unholy cold, and that mental hum propelled me forward. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to put as much distance as possible between myself and that abandoned tent, and whatever unspeakable thing it harbored. Every rustle of leaves was a pursuit, every snapping twig a hand reaching for me. I could still feel the cold, that pervasive, psychic cold, clinging to my skin. I eventually burst out of the woods onto a service road, miles from where I intended to be, my clothes torn, covered in mud and scratches, my face streaked with tears and grime. I flagged down a passing parked vehicle, driven by a concerned Ranger Miller who had evidently been searching for me. He took one look at my wild eyes, my hysterical babbling about a tent and whispers, and immediately drove me back to the station, then to a small, rural hospital. I remember the concerned faces, the gentle questions, the doctor's quiet assessment of my exhaustion and acute stress. I couldn't tell them the truth. No one would believe me. I was convinced I would be committed. I resigned from my position a few days later, citing personal reasons. I packed my meager belongings and left Blackwood National Forest without a backward glance. The small digital camera, which I had somehow managed to keep hold of, contained only blurry, useless photos of the tent's interior, proving absolutely nothing. The silver compass, too, was gone, lost somewhere in my panicked flight, a small piece of my former life swallowed by the woods. The footlocker back in my cabin still held that first river stone and small effigy, though I never went back for them. They were symbolic anchors to a reality I desperately wanted to forget but could not. The true horror, I've learned, isn't about the physical threat, but about the insidious way it infects your mind. It wasn't the tent itself, or even the unseen presence, but the profound, irreversible shift in my understanding of the world. The knowledge that such things exist, that they can observe, communicate, and manipulate, shattered my sense of reality. The abandoned tent wasn't truly empty, and in confronting it, a part of me became just as empty, hollowed out by fear and incomprehension. The forest, once a symbol of wild beauty, now represents an unfathomable darkness, a place where the veil between worlds is dangerously thin. I still see the tendrils, feel the cold, hear the faint, dry whisper in the deepest parts of my mind, and sometimes, late at night, in the profound silence of my new home, I swear I hear a slow, rhythmic drag scrape coming from the closet, as if something has followed me, patiently waiting. It has been months since I left the Blackwood National Forest, but the forest never truly left me. The quiet of my new apartment, miles from any ancient woods, often feels less like peace and more like a fragile silence, easily shattered by the smallest sound. I find myself constantly checking the locks, peering through peepholes, an unshakable paranoia my unwanted heir to that summer. My dreams are still vivid, still filled with the oppressive cold of that tent, the unsettling movements behind its canvas walls, and the memory of those dark, intelligent tendrils reaching out. The world feels different now, less solid, less predictable. I see shadows in the corners of my vision, hear whispers in the ambient noise of the city, and the casual rustle of leaves outside my window can still send a jolt of ice through my veins. The smooth, gray river stones, the faceless effigies, the torn tent, They are all indelible images etched into the landscape of my mind. I am forever marked by that encounter, a silent survivor of a horror that defies definition. I know, with chilling certainty, that I stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting patiently for someone to find its abandoned tent and unwittingly step into its domain. I don't know what it wanted or why it chose me. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was merely announcing its eternal presence. But the true terror is this: the lingering doubt, the gnawing question of whether it truly remained in those deep woods, or if a piece of it, a fragment of its awareness, attached itself to me, a silent, unseen passenger. Sometimes, when the night is utterly still, I can almost feel its presence, a faint, psychic cold settling in the room, and I wonder if the forest's secrets are ever truly left behind, or if they merely follow, patiently waiting for the moment to remind you that you are never truly safe. Share your theories, or if you've experienced similar inexplicable events, tell me in the comments below.